Hi, everybody. Tonight we're going to be talking about a ancient philosophical topic for our philosophical exploration. And that topic is the topic of death, and specifically the topic of learning how to die. And in ancient contemplative practice, philosophizing was synonymous with meditating on death. And to the ancients, this meditation was referred to as Melete, Thanatou, and I'll briefly describe what that Greek term means. But it's a theme that's central to the legendary drama involving the trial and execution of Socrates, this theme of dying. And the death of Socrates served as the model of the sage remaining philosophical and tranquil in the face of adversity. And the Socratic philosophy toward death was later embraced by the Epicureans and then by the Stoics. And so in this next series of philosophical explorations, I'd like to examine the major philosophers and the philosophical schools and what they had to say about the relationship between philosophizing and learning how to die. And I thought we could examine the Pythagorean and the Socratic and the Epicurean and the Stoic philosophies towards death. And perhaps also looking at some later thinkers who also espoused a philosophy toward death, including, but not limited to, Shakespeare and Montaigne. So that's kind of something to look forward to. But for our conversation today, I thought we would just stick to the fundamental questions, perhaps some preliminary questions and some definitions to go over, just to provide a bit of orientation to the discussion, and so we can get maybe clear on sort of the concepts we're talking about. So to philosophize, of course, is to speculate or theorize about the fundamental or the significant issues of human existence. And to learn, of course, is to acquire new knowledge or skill by some study, through experience, through being taught by somebody else. To die is to simply stop living. And a related term, death, is the action or fact that we will die or be killed. And this definition suggests that death is the cessation of life for a living organism. Now, to meditate is to focus the mind upon something for an extended period of time, typically in silence, sometimes with the aid of certain meditative devices such as chanting or something along those lines. And the aim is typically for a religious or a spiritual purpose, or simply as a method of relaxation. Meditation, a related term, is the activity or practice of meditating. Now, as to Melete, Thanatou, that Greek term that I previously mentioned, was a Stoic meditation technique, and it essentially involves contemplation of death. And in particular, it involves reflecting on one's mortality and viewing that fact dispassionately, and as something that is necessary to human existence, that can't be avoided. And what the Stoics did, and what some neo-Stoics and people who today follow Stoic philosophy did and do, are to, as a matter of ritual, to remind themselves that each day could be one's last, and each person, and a person is to imagine themselves viewing the day they've had as being their last, essentially, in the most simplest terms, of course. And it involves also living in a grounded manner, centered in the present moment, and appreciating all of the bounty and the gifts that life affords us, and in such a way as you fully embrace what you have, as if you were sitting at a banquet or something along those lines. You rejoice in the bounty of life in that manner. And then the term Melete, which is part of Melete Thanatou, was in Greek mythology a muse, one of the original muses, and her sisters being Aeode and Meneme. Hopefully I've got those pronunciations right. In any case, she was one of the original muses. And the term Melete itself means to ponder or to contemplate. So it's fitting for the Stoic. It's a fitting term for the Stoic meditation, because it just means to meditate upon death, Melete Thanatou. And so Thanatou, of course, meaning death in Greek. So all of these terms we just briefly examined kind of provides, I guess, a bit of a brief overview of the metaphysical, the metaphysical issues that present themselves within this discussion on meditating upon death. So some other questions, though, that I would like to ask are perhaps that are also metaphysical in nature, things such as what happens to a person when he dies, what is the fear of death, what is death anxiety. These are things we might eventually get to, although I don't know if we will over the course of this conversation. But those are some metaphysical questions to consider with regards to death. And there's also some epistemological questions to consider, and questions such as, can a person know what happens when one dies? As well as ethical questions we could pursue, such as, should one fear death? How can one overcome the fear of death? What's the appropriate attitude toward death? How should one conduct oneself in regards to the reality of one's death? So these are all of these metaphysical and epistemological and ethical questions, I think, are questions that are relevant to this philosophical practice of meditating upon death. Because to meditate upon death, I think, is in some sense to consider, these questions and perhaps ways of answering them, or ways of at least arriving at some sort of approximation to an answer, and then allowing that to, I suppose, help you develop your theoretical and your practical wisdom as a human being, by asking these questions and attempting at answers. So I thought, just to get into the actual philosophical material itself, we could maybe start at, one of the earliest places maybe in the history of Western philosophy where the philosophical practice of meditating upon death first kind of came into being, as far as we know, according to our historical knowledge. And the Pythagoreans were perhaps the first to come up with this meditation practice of meditating upon death. And I'd like to just briefly go over a passage from the Golden Verses of Pythagoras, which is a book of verses which is some scholars attribute to Pythagoras, although that's not definitive, and it could have been someone just espousing ideas that were, had affinities with Pythagorean philosophy. So the passage I'm going to go over is attributed to an anonymous source, but it could have been Pythagoras. And I'll just briefly go over that, and we can talk about its implications regarding meditating upon death. So to quote this anonymous says, then make the habit never inconsiderably to act, neither forget that death is appointed to all, that possessions here gladly gathered, here must be left. So what does that mean, and what does that have to do with meditating upon death, I guess? Well, I think on my reading, the verse is imploring the individual never to act mindlessly to begin with. And it also suggests that an individual should not forget that they will die, since death is the common fate of humanity. And it indicates that, though it is good to have possessions that make one's life better, in the end, one will have to let them go, and one will have to inevitably die. So I think in some sense, the verse seems to be admonishing an individual to be detached from earthly possessions for the sake of psychological health. And so that's what I take from it. And I to my understanding, I think this meditation kind of addresses sort of the ethical and the practical aspect of meditating upon death, and how that meditation can lend itself to perhaps adapting to the reality of that better for such things as psychological health and well-being. So I guess that's what I think of this first verse here. I don't know if you have a similar interpretation, Ryan, or what you kind of, the insights you glean from it. So I'd be curious to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I think I have the same sort of thoughts as you on this one. Like for me, when it says, never inconsiderately act, one way to do that is to remember that, death is appointed to all, so that you're going to die someday. Like having that in the forefront of your mind is an important aspect to acting in a way that is thoughtful, that is mindful, that is, measured and temperate, in a virtuous way. I think we can see this too when we consider, all the examples that we might have, even anecdotally, of, people who get some sort of diagnosis, it says that they have some sort of terminal illness. A lot of the times it changes their outlook on life and the way that they live the rest of their life. So I think having that idea of, death being or being there is something that helps you act in a way that's perhaps more measured and more thoughtful. And I think it's also the key to realizing that all these things that you acquire, it's just stuff. At the end, you're going to die and you have to leave it. So I think that middle passage that's kind of sandwiched in the in between the other two verses, or the other two lines, it's sort of like the key to understanding it, which is, again, just having death at the forefront of your mind. So yeah, I mean, I think it's pretty much the same interpretation. I was just thinking more of how the verses sort of line up with one another.
Yeah. I mean, each line of the verse seems to, get at something different. The first seems to be talking about habit, and making it a practice to never act without consideration. And so that in and of itself, I think, could be a useful, practice, life practice, and just never act out of inconsideration, to be considerate, to, I suppose, weigh reasons for and against before you make a decision, and be consciously aware of your reasons for acting, and why you wish to act in this way. What advantages does it have? Does it have advantages, or is it what I'm deciding to do maladaptive? Just mindfulness in that sense, I suppose. Also, I'm thinking it also more in terms too of like an Eastern type of mindfulness, or it seems to be akin to an Eastern sense of mindfulness. I mean, I don't really feel like Eastern philosophy itself has monopoly on, mindfulness practices. We see them in Western philosophy too, although perhaps it's given, less emphasis in our culture. But the Stoic philosophers and the ancient philosophers also emphasize mindfulness as a kind of awareness of, your thoughts and your emotions and your feelings. And so simply maybe being mindful in that sense too is part of this meditation on death. So we have like the mindfulness element, and then we have in the first line and the second line, we have this, I suppose, admonition to always remember that death is part of the human condition. It's part of what it means for you to be human. And so, like you said, it's something we should carry at the forefront of our mind. And the last line is just talking about possessions, I suppose, things you own, your car, your house, your clothing, your pets, your plants, everything you've purchased, all those things. You live beyond when you die. And I suppose there's a tranquility maybe in that sort of acceptance, and a willingness to let go, just to let things be. So that's what I kind of get from it, just from this reading. Do you have any additions or emendations or elaborations?
No, I think maybe just to clarify more what I was trying to say is like the middle line there, neither forget that death is appointed to all, is sort of like the attitude to carry with you. That's sort of like the attitude you want with you. And that's going to help you, like I said, behave in a considerate manner and to leave those things behind in a way that you're, again, not attached to them. You're not afraid to let go of these things. So I think it's for 3 lines, I think it has a lot packed into it. And I think it's a sentiment that you still hear today in like popular culture in a lot of ways. So it's interesting to see how modern it is. I do see your citation here. It says 1988. I don't think that's when Pythagoras wrote it, but that's obviously where you got the source from. So
yes, I think that
you did say though that you're not sure if this was like a verified work from Pythagoras, or what did you mention there at the start of this conversation?
Well, from the source from which I got this verse from, it was quoted as being anonymous. So, but what I think I might do is go back to that source and see if I can authenticate it and see if it was in fact coming from Pythagoras. So I think that would probably allow us to know for sure whether it was Pythagoras, but I know that the Pythagoreans did have this practice, so it wasn't something that Pythagoras himself, had did exclusively, but it was part of that whole school, I suppose. Mm-hmm. So, anyways, those are sort of my main thoughts on that. I suppose one thing, just before transitioning to the next topic, is that I think possessions too, when they're clung to, when people hold attachment towards them, that can also induce suffering, because I suppose we worry about what we fear to lose, and if we hold certain possessions dear to us too tightly, there might be some, psychological stress and suffering that might go with that. And so I also think like the reality of your death, if you accept that, it can alleviate a lot of that suffering, the suffering that comes from, I guess that fear of what you're afraid to lose, your possessions and everything else. So in any case, yes, that might be worth pursuing in some more detail as we proceed along. Maybe it'll link up to what we talk about further on. And speaking of furthering on, this next meditation I wanted to talk about was the one that Socrates engaged in his Socratic dialogue, Plato's Apology. And what I thought we could do, because I want to spend maybe the majority of the time we have in our conversation talking about the Socratic meditation upon death, I thought perhaps talking about the context around his meditation on death could provide us with some more orientation to the discussion and some more background to the discussion. And so maybe I'll just discuss in brief what the apology is about. And essentially, for our purposes, the Socratic meditation upon death is perhaps best represented in this dialogue. That's why I wanted to focus on it. And the apology itself is a dialogue in which Socrates gives a speech of legal self-defense to during his trial, in which he's been charged for impiety and corruption of the Athenian citizenry. And specifically, he's charged with corrupting the youth and not believing in the gods in whom the city believes in, as well as believing. Essentially, I just said it there. Believing in the gods that the city of Athens doesn't approve in. So if he's charged as guilty, then his penalty is death in this dialogue. And within his speech in this dialogue, Socrates addresses questions that have bearing on the meditation upon death. And these include philosophical issues of the fear of death, the issue of whether or not one can know what happens when one dies, and the appropriate attitude and the optimal practical stance that one should take toward death. And in his meditation on the nature of death, Socrates declares to his accusers that the unexamined life is not worth living. So clearly, Socrates is examining the nature of death in the Apology and its many aspects. And he avoids the fate that he admonishes his accusers against. So his examination of the nature of death in the Apology, I think, is exemplary of the examined life most worth living. And so I thought what we could do in our own, I suppose, meditation on death is to examine some of the key epistemological and ethical questions that are explored in the Apology. And I think that I like to focus on some of the key passages within the Apology to this end. And what I would like to go over are some propositions that I have formulated on the basis of my reading of these passages. And because I think they really get to, in some sense, what Socrates' meditation upon death is all about. And so I thought I'd briefly just read over the passage or the salient bits of it briefly. And then I thought we could reflect on its implications for meditating upon death. So I'll do that just briefly. So this first proposition is that the fear of death is born of ignorance and not wisdom. So having provided some context to our discussion, I'd like to delve more specifically into this these epistemological and ethical questions, and that Socrates raises and addresses regarding death. And in this first passage, as I've noted in reading about that proposition, he's addressing the fear of death, and the fear of death has both. For Socrates, I think, is born both out of erroneous epistemological and ethical and practical assumptions that are somewhat interlinked. And So maybe I'll just briefly go over this passage, then and then I'll offer my own comments here. So Socrates says in the dialogue that to fear death, gentlemen, is no other than to think oneself wise when one is not, to think one knows what one does not know. Socrates says no one knows whether death may not be the greatest of all blessings for a man, yet men fear it as if they knew that it is the greatest of evils. And Socrates then says, and surely it is the most blameworthy ignorance to believe that one knows what one does not know. It is perhaps on this final point, and in this respect, gentlemen, that I differ from the majority of men. And if I were to claim that I am wiser than anyone in anything, it would be in this, that as I have no adequate knowledge of the things in the underworld, so I do not think I have. I do know, however, that it is wicked and shameful to do wrong, to disobey one's superior, be he God or man. So he continues on with the speech there, but I would just like to highlight that part of the speech because I think that that touches upon some of the key issues, I think, that are relevant to understanding what it means to meditate upon death, how that impacts one's conduct in life. And I think what he's getting at here is, with regards to the epistemological assumption, is that what Socrates is saying is that to fear death is born from the false belief that an individual might confuse as true beliefs. So, for example, that death is bad, that death or the process of dying produces suffering, that the reality of death cheapens life, and so on and so forth. So he thinks fear of death it seems to me, according to my reading, it seems like it's based upon those false beliefs, those false assumptions. And Socrates seems to be suggesting, that it's a vice to engage in that type of thinking. And so, there's a lot going on here, and I think Socrates in this passage is addressing some of the questions that I brought up previously in sort of introducing this discussion. But this ethical question that it raises is, what is the appropriate attitude toward death? And the appropriate attitude toward death, I think, is to never fear or avoid death, since death is an unknown, and one should never fear an unknown. And what this, I think, Socrates seems to be raising in this passage is that this ethical question of how should one conduct oneself in regards to the reality of one's death, and some practical wisdom, which I think can be extracted from this passage, is that are several practical precepts which I think could be helpful in coping with. And the first precept here is do not believe that you know what happens when you die, since you cannot know this. I think this belief might be practically useful insofar as false beliefs regarding death and the afterlife may have maladaptive consequences. So, for example, if one believes that one will be punished for one's sins upon death, for example, in some kind of hell, then one may this may lead to a sort of a generalized sense of fear towards death, which could serve as the root of other fears. Another false belief could be, the process of death and dying will be painful and lead to suffering, and therefore it's something to be dreaded. Another false belief might be that life is inherently meaningless because one will die. So that's more of a nihilistic belief. So I think that we could generate, a list of more beliefs that could be maladaptive. So I think Socrates is admonishing us, not to believe in such things as those, because such beliefs are maladaptive. And the question too that it also raises is this epistemological question. Can a person know what happens when one dies? And Socrates seems to be saying no. And he also seems to be pointing out the limits of human knowledge. We do not know what fate awaits us upon death, nor do we know what will be awaiting us in the underworld. So he seems to be getting at that as well. And so, there's a lot going on there. And what I think he's trying to say is that someone who fears death lacks both wisdom and knowledge, and by extrapolation, someone who does not fear death would be someone who possesses both wisdom and knowledge, I think. And so a question I want to ask is, what might this wisdom and knowledge be? And also, I'd like to briefly touch again on the epistemological claim in this passage, and I think it represents a core theme, a principle within Socrates' philosophy more generally, which is, this admission to ignorance, and that Socrates seems to possess wisdom insofar as he knows nothing, and at least that was according to the Oracle of Delphi. And Socrates, of course, sought to confirm or disconfirm the oracle's claim that Socrates was the wisest man in the land, and so I think we could raise some questions. What is Socrates' wisdom in this regard? Is it a theoretical wisdom, or is it a practical wisdom? What are the theoretical and practical consequences of Socrates' wisdom? His admission to ignorance, and what's the value of consciously acknowledging one's ignorance in that regard? So I know that was sort of a densely packed passage there, and I really tried to unpack a lot of what was going on there. But how does this sit with you, Ryan, at this point?
Yeah, I think it. I've been focusing on Epicurus and his philosophy, and it seems to fit just nicely with one another, the two philosophies and the two attitudes, at least from sort of like an epistemological sense. What attitude we're supposed to kind of have towards death, and what can we know about it. So I guess it's kind of ethical and epistemological. So the quote that I grabbed actually from Epicurus that I think relates to this really well. It says, "The many at one moment shun death as the greatest of evils. At another, they yearn for it as a respite from the evils in life. So the wise man neither seeks to escape life nor fears the cessation of life. For neither does life offend him, nor does the absence of life seem to be any evil." So he seems to be poking at two different attitudes that he's saying are wrong. And what he's saying is that people who think that something great's going to come after life or in death, or something terrible is going to happen after life or in death, those are the wrong attitudes to have, because we don't know. And I think that's what Socrates is saying. So like having an attitude one way or the other, I think that's where problems for our life here and now leak in. I think in one sense, if you feel like death is this horrible thing, you're going to sit there with this death anxiety. But if you think death is great, well, then you're maybe not going to be living the most, or acting the most considerately or wisely in the here and the now either, if you think there's some better, more beautiful afterlife. So I think the right attitude, the philosophical attitude that's being preached by Epicurus and Socrates here is sort of this philosophical attitude of indifference towards death.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's a good way of interpreting it. Indifference being neither for it or against it, I guess, in some sense. I think there might, I would look at the usefulness of the belief that one has about death, and then if it's a useful belief, then perhaps it's one worth adhering to. If you look at a belief such as death is to be feared because it'll be a process of suffering or something along these lines. Any beliefs to that effect, that is that. Dogmatic, I guess, is one which could be not very useful, to the degree that maybe death is not something that is painful in and of itself. We might experience pain in the process of dying, but death itself, that moment where consciousness ceases, if that's what happens, perhaps that's not such a bad thing. Maybe we won't experience that. And so in some sense, yes, I think, we shouldn't have any, I suppose, exaggerated or false beliefs about the negative consequences of dying, but at the same time, I don't think we should have any exaggerated or false beliefs about the consequences, the positive consequences of what's going to happen when we die either. I think maybe I don't know exactly where I sit at this stage. I think there might be some pragmatic value in believing that death's a good thing to an extent. It's not necessarily something that's to be feared. So maybe we can examine that a bit further on as we continue. I think one thing, I don't know if you want to go down this rabbit hole right now, but we could touch on a bit more on Epicurus, because I think you had some interesting things to say about Epicurus in this respect too, regarding this fact that we, according to Epicurus, we know of death, we don't know death. What do you make of that claim? And then how does that impact our, the way we live, given the reality of our death?
I think that's obviously like an epistemological claim. So we know of death, we see it every day. People die every day, but we don't know. Like Socrates was saying, like, we don't know what awaits us on the other side. Like, we don't know anything of the underworld, and in principle we can't, because when we're dead, we don't have experience, right? Like, our experience stops at death's door, so to speak. It doesn't go through that door, and so we don't know what's beyond that, and we can't know what's beyond that. So I think that's sort of Epicurus's attitude, and that's sort of what leads him to deny what's kind of called the harm thesis. So the idea that death is in some sense harmful to us. Well, we can't know that, and in fact, there's kind of a tendency to lean towards the fact that it can't be harmful, because there's anything that's harmful or pleasant, that all occurs in sensation, all in experience. And if there is no experience or sensation after death, then how can it be a harm to us, right? So I think that's sort of the strategy, at least on the Epicurean front, for getting people to not fear death anymore, right? Because like, once you're dead, nothing can hurt you, right?
Right.
So I think that's sort of where I sit with that, or where Epicurus sits with that.
Yeah, it's an interesting argument. I think too that in some sense, to probe a bit more deeply, that Epicurus's epistemological stance towards death, that we know of death, we don't know death. What for me, I think it seems to be suggesting is that we know of death as a phenomenon of human existence, and I guess we know of it secondhand, through the fact that we might witness someone else's death. We might read about the fact of death in a book or something along these lines. We might have a concept of what death is. But death in and of itself doesn't seem to be like anything we ever would directly experience, because if we assume that we're simply material organisms, that when the body stops functioning and consciousness stops functioning, it would seem that when that happens, we wouldn't experience any pain or suffering from death, because we would be dead. We wouldn't have any, suffering in some sense seems to require some consciousness of it. And so when we are dead, we're not conscious if we are our bodies. So it seems like Epicurus's sort of argument here with regards to death and what happens with respect to our knowledge of it seems to kind of presuppose sort of a materialist view of consciousness, which I might take issue with. If consciousness is something that continues after the death of the body, then it would seem that there might be a possibility of suffering insofar as we can suffer, in consciousness alone. Or maybe we wouldn't. Maybe something else would happen entirely, and we would be liberated from that pain. But that's going into, I guess, a realm of speculation, which could take us in directions, I guess, far beyond the discussion at hand, which is this question of meditating upon death and what this meditation implies metaphysically and epistemologically and ethically with regards to us as philosophers. So I think we've covered a lot of interesting issues up until this point in the conversation. And I thought we could maybe wrap up the conversation and continue the thread at another time. And delve a bit more deeply into the apology and some of the other propositions that I take to be perhaps central with respect to Socrates' meditation on death. So maybe I'll just briefly wrap up where we've been so far. So we began with a brief introduction to the topic, and we looked over some of the fundamental concepts to understanding this philosophical topic of philosophizing upon death. And we also touched in brief upon the Pythagorean outlook on death and what the Pythagorean meditation upon death involves. And then from there, we transitioned to a discussion about the Socratic meditation upon death in the Apology. And so I'd like to continue our conversation on that meditation, perhaps in our next exploration, and see where we are at that stage. So do you have any final thoughts to add, Ryan, before we close?
No, I think that's a good place to stop. I'll just keep adding notes too with Epicurus, and we'll kind of like work them in as we go along. And yeah, I'm looking forward to our next conversation. Okay,
sounds good. Well, hopefully this conversation was coherent enough for everybody. Hopefully it's becoming a bit more coherent as we go along. So we'll resume where we left off next time around. So until then, stay tuned, everybody.